Good afternoon and welcome back. I'm Cynthia Monpoint, and if you have been trekking with us, we are going through the Massachusetts Marijuana Social Equity Report that I put together to analyze Massachusetts equity programs through the lens of those who have been harmed the most by the war on drugs and the victims of mass incarceration. We are currently on observation 4 in a series of 10 observations about the program, and for every observation, we have been providing a recommendation, an actionable recommendation, going through certain evidence that support that observation and commentary as to why the recommendation is put forth. So let's go ahead and jump right in with observation 4. The CCC provides insufficient accommodations for EEs and SEs part 2. Again, this is part 2, meaning in observation 3, we discussed this a little bit. Here, the focus in the recommendation is that accommodations address the harms of marijuana mass incarceration. So 1, be intentional about accommodations made to address the harms of marijuana mass incarceration and facilitate participation in this industry. And 2, quantify and offer options for restitution as compensation to the victims of marijuana mass incarceration for the collateral consequences of the war waged against them. See, the CCC made decisions about whom would be the recipients and participants in this program, how they would be compensated, or what type of restorative actions would be given to them, and when, in what fashion would that take place without the input of the actual victims who are the targets of these programs. And so the evidence here is that prior to legalization, the harm of the war on drugs was commonplace rhetoric in the push to legalize the cannabis plant. The information circulated clearly called out the injustices happening to Black and brown people, particularly Black and brown men, across the nation and here in Massachusetts. However, the restorative acts that are recommended fail to even identify these populations. Instead, the decision was made to call out the communities as in the zip codes where the injustices and terrorism occurred. And so this is why the first part of the recommendation is to be very intentional about accommodations and that ensuring that they're addressing the actual victims of mass incarceration and not just the zip codes. We talk a little bit more about that in later on in several other observations. The other evidence that's shared is that through the social equity program, participants are offered benefits including technical assistance in the form of training by state-approved vendors. However, that is not enough. Again, this does not factor into the collateral consequences that victims of mass incarceration have endured, the long-term trauma, time, opportunities that have been lost. And in this section of the report, I include a graphic that highlights from the National Inventory of the Collateral Consequences of Conviction, the many areas that impact an individual's life when they are victims of mass incarceration. Everything from the impact on benefits, whether they be government benefits, schooling opportunities, the impact on this particular list includes the impact on employment, housing, family and domestic rights. And so the list is quite extensive. And when we look at the recommendations for restorative act, they don't address all of those. They don't come close to it. In fact, the CCC and legislative body decided that the restorative justice in the form of expungement of records would be would act along with training clinics. In the context of the war on drugs, where individuals were penalized, criminalized, attacked, families decimated, communities destroyed, expungement of records does not address any of those harms, any of those injustices. And arguably, I point out in this report, to push forward expungement is criminal. So first, let's talk more about why it is that it's insufficient. And this ties into what we've discussed so far. It doesn't address the consequences of the war on drugs. It doesn't address the injustices that have happened. And so if the argument, which it tends to often be as expungement has become part of the status quo with a conversation around restorative act across the country, if the argument is that expungements would allow for employment opportunities, then it's important that we put this in the proper context. One, when we look at employment, so I'm going to read exactly the source cited here. Studies show Black graduates are nearly 2 times more likely to be unemployed than their white peers. That is one. And secondly, another report shows that while college attainment helps all workers get more access to better paying, stable jobs and better benefits, the advantages are not evenly distributed. Black workers, no matter their level of education, still face impediments in the labor workforce, employment discrimination, occupational segregation, and unequal pay. And even through my own personal experience in various capacities where I've witnessed you well overqualified candidates, Black candidates applying for positions well suited to meet the qualifications of the position without any query. So in essence, they had a stellar application and they were denied the opportunity. Instead, the opportunity was given to a white counterpart. And the reasoning being that they weren't a cultural fit. So putting these things into consideration, employment, having a query or a record tied to low-level marijuana use is not the reason why Black people are not being hired. Secondly, if that were the case, then the requirement should be that low-level marijuana charges, convictions, what have you, should not be utilized. It's actually make it illegal to discriminate employment or any other benefit or opportunity along those grounds. When you do a query, there are levels to queries, and so while the marijuana offense may have been deemed a low level or to appear on a low level query, that can be changed, and so that when a query is ran on an individual, that does not show up. But let's get at the heart as to why this is criminal to expunge the record, because it is not the victim of mass incarceration that committed the crime. The crime has been enacted by our American government, by our local enforcement. And so to erase that record is to erase the history, the evidence, and the documentation of the crimes waged against hundreds of thousands of people. For every expungement week, every expungement clinic, every expungement act that's taken, that is launched and executed, those are records of evidence tied to the terrorism that ensued due to the campaign on the war on drugs. See, mass incarceration was one of the effects of the war on drugs, and the records are evidence of that. When we're looking at the data that shows who was incarcerated, who was targeted, how were they targeted, that information ties back to these records, and to erase that is to eliminate that evidence from history. And it positions us for the next generation of folks who are coming up to not understand the context of why it is that our communities are dealing with trauma, long-term trauma, that research shows continues to ensue for not just the individual, but their families, their children who have had to deal with the consequences of the victimization. And so we already, as a society with this data, struggle to understand what happened as a result of the war on drugs. And so imagine removing this evidence, removing the data point, the the fact that these are the numbers and these are the people to whom that were to whom the war ensued upon and the injustices were targeted. And then fast forward to the point that we hope the intention is to directly provide restitution to the very individuals who were the victims of mass incarceration. And if the records are expunged, there's no way to find these victims. For those reasons, we highly suggest, the recommendation is strongly put forth that the victims of mass incarceration be engaged to find out what it is, how restorative acts would benefit them, would address the harms that they as individuals ensued, because it may not necessarily be the same. And if expungement is really the go-to answer because for whatever reasons that are put forth, then the restorative act needs to be quantified. It needs to be quantified, and the victims need to be compensated so greatly that that is recorded in history. And so then there is context for why an individual and certain populations received significant restitution, significant compensation for the harms done to them, because now it's understood, oh, okay, these were victims of mass incarceration. Yes, the records may have been expunged, but here we have documentation as to how that victimization was ameliorated directly for those who suffered the brunt of the war on drugs. And with that, we'll wrap up recommendation 4. And for this video clip, join us for recommendation 5 on the next, observation 5 and recommendation 5 on the next video clip. Thank you.